I chose How to Tame a Wild Tongue by Gloria Anzaldúa on page 280 as the title that sparked my curiosity. How to Tame a Wild Tongue hints at a woman that speaks her mind. Obviously, it's a female author, and she is Hispanic. I have more recently been around more Hispanic Americans due to my job and my relocation to a big city where Hispanics are a greatly represented minority. So I read the story, and Miss Gloria starts out by comparing the situation, or she starts with an anecdote from the dentist, where a dentist literally tried to calm down her ever-moving tongue. And she quotes Ray Gwynn Smith, who said, "Who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war?" And this short quote really sums up her whole story and the point that she is making in this brief essay. She continues to use a lot of Spanish quotes throughout her essay. Some of them are English and Spanish mixed together, which shows that she's addressing the Hispanic population that speaks both languages. It's still comfortable to read if you don't understand Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, and I still got the message loud and clear. But some of the information is not translated here, which is a little bit excluding for those who don't speak Spanish or didn't grow up around it. She explains a lot about the linguistics of Spanish-speaking Americans. She shows that there are 8 different versions of it, which was news to me. She even goes so far as to call it linguistic terrorism on page 284, where she describes that even Hispanics amongst each other are sometimes hostile over language differences. I was a bit surprised at how strongly she felt about this. My background is somewhat similar. I'm not Hispanic, but I was born and raised in Germany. I grew up speaking German. English is my second language, and I also learned French in school. So I know all too well what it's like to be in a country that doesn't have all the same values, that doesn't have the same language that you grew up with. But I was raised embracing those differences and learning, striving to assimilate while still holding on to your own culture. And it's actually a very enriching experience that way. So in that sense, it was a little hard for me to read some of the resentful messages that she has against Americans. I understand that there's some discrimination, but I think overall it's a great opportunity for anybody to come to a new country and learn about their culture. So the hostility, I think, is really uncalled for. I did some further research on the topic, and I found an article by Sharon Lee and Barry Edmonston on Hispanic intermarriage identification and U.S. Latino population change. And here I found that the population has grown substantially in the recent decades. From 1950, when we had 3% of Hispanics in the United States, we went up to 13% in 2000. So the growth is rapid. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think merging cultures are a beautiful thing and an opportunity for growth on both sides, rather than a cause for anybody to lose their identity. She uses a lot of visual descriptions in her story. For example, she describes how she misses the food, the homemade white cheese sizzling in a pan, melting inside of a folded tortilla. That's on page 287. So she uses a lot of very visual language to sort of explain where she came from and how much she loves her culture, which is really a neat story. I just wish that she were embracing her present a little more rather than glorifying her past. Let's see. So her thesis, I would say, is that the Spanish language should be embraced more in the American culture, and that Spanish-speaking women should have an opportunity to express themselves in Spanish rather than having to assimilate to Anglo-American culture, which I think it's already gone very far in some areas. For example, anytime you call customer service, you're able to request Spanish information instead of English. There are a lot of medical programs that greatly embrace the Spanish speaking population, and I think that it just gives any immigrant much greater chances to go ahead and learn the language of the country they moved to, rather than approaching it with hostility. The other essay I read, the title for which I found a little less interesting, was Take the F by Ian Fraser on page 59. The title, Take the F, I actually thought it was probably about grades, like school grades, and I just didn't think it was a very interesting title. When I did start reading the story, it turned out to be very different. It's about Brooklyn, New York, and this young father describes his experience in Brooklyn. He's not originally from there. He's actually from the country, as he describes on page 60. However, he seems to be quite intrigued with his new home, and he also explains how his daughter is growing up as a city child, and he embraces it. The F is actually a train. It's part of the subway system that connects to New York City, and he describes what he sees around himself looking out from the subway train, as well as walking around the neighborhood there. He also uses a lot of visual language. For example, on page 61, he describes how growing over a wall just before the tunnel there's a wisteria bush which blooms pale blue every May. So he paints some very romantic pictures like that, and then he'll put it into a very stark contrast. For example, when he talks about a thin woman and a fat woman sitting side by side, and they had a long and loud conversation about someone they intended to slap silly. So he's kind of showing all the variety that's going on in Brooklyn, and that is kind of the charm of that city, as I'm gathering. He also uses a quote that stands out. It says, "Cops protect citizens who protect us from cops," which shows kind of the poverty aspect and the crime aspect that is ever present in the big city. So between all these different extremes, he's painting a very colorful picture of Brooklyn, New York. His audience, I would say, it's really anybody who hasn't been to Brooklyn. It almost seems like he wants to tell everyone about his experience and maybe invite people to come to Brooklyn to experience it for themselves. The language is very easy to understand, and he uses a lot of street names, names of parks, and names of areas of Brooklyn. So it's almost like a travel guide, if you will. So the thesis, you might say, is that everybody should experience the hustle and bustle in the big city, and even if it's not for everybody to live, it's certainly a great place to experience, even if it's just to see something new for a change. As far as other perspectives on this topic, I found some more information, and that came from Marcella Aid from My Impressions of Working in a Foreign Country in Brooklyn, New York, which is another impression from somebody who moved to Brooklyn, New York after coming from an entirely different background abroad. And some of the information there was that in 1790 there were only 4,495 people in the city of Brooklyn, and now in 2010 there were 2.5 million people. So the growth is rapid, and people are coming from all over the place to join into the busy life there. And it's causing a lot of conflict, aside from a very rich melting pot. So those are really the different sides that you get to see in Brooklyn.